Okay, so I'm going to call this conflict of narratives or ideological structures information wars. That's a
Yeah, let's
term
do that.
that people have used. Could go by a lot of different things, but clearly these information wars across human history have been waged uh, with information technology, right? That whatever
Right.
medium is propagating the message of the day is very important to that. You mentioned newspapers, you mentioned 20th century broadcasting. All of that was part and parcel to these. That's basically the equipment of these information wars, or the weapons, if you will.
Right.
And going into the digital age, there's this tectonic shift in information technology. And it seems like the big pull now is like, okay, you've got existing entrenched interests trying to pull us to a centralized grand narrative like Schwab is describing. And then maybe on the decentralized media side, there's people that are just kind of, I guess, becoming investigative journalists by
Correct.
accident in a way. Like you're just
Yeah. Yeah.
seeing what's out there.
There's two types. There's the people who just by accident become it, and then there are actual people from the mainstream media who are now, because of this COVID thing, kind of shook loose a bunch of people who are now starting their own. Robinson used to be, mainstream media. Now she's she's all, well, let's call it independent, not alternative. It's independent. Um, a couple Infowars reporters came from the mainstream media. I mean, it's becoming a thing. I mean, it used to be just full on independent people. Now it's like it's bringing people from who cut. The lies are so bad they can't even handle it anymore. Like they're having cognitive dissonance.
Right, right, right. So let me ask you about that then, because you mentioned obviously propaganda is part and parcel to these information wars. That's when you're trying to implant a narrative or a perspective into people's minds. If you've
Correct.
seen the movie Inception, it's something like that, but with less dreams, more just, narrative. How, and we always have to flip this and look at ourselves and say, okay, well, how would our audience know? How can they discern whether we're propagandists or truth seekers or truth tellers? How do you distinguish between the two? Like, how does your filter work to where you say, oh, this is propaganda or misinformation or disinformation? This is more um, authentic, I guess, a more authentic message, let's say.
Well, there's two things. One is discernment. Does it ring true to you when you hear it, just in your gut? And I've had that my whole life. And do the facts on their face make sense to you? And if they don't, then that it requires investigation. Also, I've learned that when someone reports on a source document, they're going to spin the narrative. So more often than not, I go straight to the source document. I don't care about the spin or the narrative. I want to read the document for myself, whether it's a Federal Reserve press release or WhiteHouse.gov or Trump says something. I'm not going to read what the Wall Street Journal or New York Times says about what Trump said. I'm going to read what Trump said. And then, so I do a lot of going straight to the source. Independent journalists, you got to be careful because people do, we're humans, so people have agendas. So you got to find people that, and this is what I did on Wall Street. So this is the second thing I went to. On Wall Street, I liked, I covered technology and software, and I was a portfolio manager and an energy company. So I had to work with, a lot of smart sell side analysts at, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, wherever. And I had to figure out who were the best, but also who were the ones willing to admit they were wrong and pull a 180. Because part of being good on Wall Street was not. Buying a stock is easy, but knowing when to sell it is more important, and admitting when you're wrong, right? So I like to follow people who can admit when they're wrong. Alex Jones has admitted he's wrong. He doesn't claim he knows everything, and he's bombastic. So I know how to read between the lines. Like, you have to kind of have your own filter, and you also have to follow people who have admitted mistakes. Anyone who one thing I can't say about the mainstream, they never admit they ever made a mistake, and they keep that's a subtle form of gaslighting. I'm perfect, but we've documented times they were wrong. They never admit it, and they keep going along as if they're perfect. It's insanity. So that's how you can kind of navigate the independent media. I mean, always And I'll always, just because we're independent doesn't mean we're good, and it doesn't mean we don't have agendas. You have to have your own discernment, and it doesn't mean, and not everybody in independent media is a good person. And there are people that have been propped up as independent media people who I'm not going to say publicly, but I suspect are COINTELPRO. They're what do you call it? Controlled opposition.
Gotcha. Double agents.
Where they tell truth on 80% of it, but then the 20% that the establishment wants them not to touch, they lie, or they navigate around. And those are easy to find. One name comes to mind. I'm not going to say it, but I think a lot of people could figure it out.
Fair enough. So that's helpful. Going straight to the source, discernment or trusting the gut, and following people who are humble or enough, right, to admit when they're wrong and whatnot.
Yeah.
You mentioned also the Drudge Report as one of those early independent media outlets, but then you said, but he became compromised. How do you discern when someone shifts from, say, pursuing truth to becoming compromised? And I guess that compromise presumably means towing a party line of some kind, I assume.
Well, yeah. So he was viewed as a conservative guy, but he really wasn't. All he was doing was aggregating headlines. He didn't write it. He hardly wrote anything, and he broke the Monica Lewinsky story. But other than a couple things, he mostly was an aggregator of headlines. But he did it in such a way that it was a good way to view what was really going on, because media will report on things, but the way they position it or highlight it is a way of making sure it goes away. So if you have a story that's on page 28 of the paper, no one's going to read it if it's not on the front page. But Drudge had a good knack for finding important things on page 28 and just putting it on his page. You're like, wow, that's a super interesting story. What happened was he saw what was coming in terms of the censorship. He got scared, and then he sold his company, basically. So once he sold it, you could tell there was a massive shift towards highlighting what an agenda. And so once he kind of gave up ownership, that's when I knew. I haven't looked at the Drudge Report in over a decade. I'm now watching Citizens Free Press.
Fair enough. Yeah. So what? Okay. So I guess as a second order piece of advice to distinguishing truth telling from propaganda, you also need to watch the incentives of the individuals you're following, right? If they sell their company, then their incentives have changed a lot, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense too.
Yeah. Whenever you're watching an independent news person or source, you're just going to know where are they in life. And if they're in the building something and then they want to punch out, that you get a question. Well, okay, you do deserve to monetize it. People do have homes to buy, families to raise. But if they, one thing I admire about Alex Jones is he saw what was coming, so he built up a products part of his media, so he didn't have to rely on advertising because he knew they'd pull it, and they did. So now he built an independent money generating machine. Where do the cash flows come from for these people? If the cash flows come from an in-store place or what have you, that's more credible than you have a you're backed by some unknown family somewhere and you have a white nut. You just got to always, what are the sources of funding? Where do they get their money? How do they make the money?
Yeah. Follow the money, as they say, and you can get a better framing on someone's intentions overall.
Correct.
Because if someone's sponsoring you, then presumably some of that intention is getting through too, right? They're sponsoring you for a reason.
Right. There's some conservative influencers who I know, I'm not going to name them because I don't want to get into wars with them, but they're some of their money comes from the Koch brothers, and the Koch brothers are they're put up as these evil right wingers. Actually, they give more money to the Democrats. They're capitalists, crony capitalists. They don't care. They'll let you think they're right wingers. What they want to do is control the narrative. One of their narratives is they want cheap labor, so they want to make sure that immigration and the borders are wide open. So they want to steer people away from that. So they have other agendas, hidden agendas. That's this kind of, when you see someone that you like not going after an issue, ask the question, why not?
Right.
Not that everybody has to hit every issue, but if they never talk about it, there's a reason.
Right.